G'day everybody, welcome to Promoting and Enforcing Human Rights, all you budding activists, human rights lawyers, and most importantly, Year 12 Legal Studies students. Welcome again. Okay, first of all, we're going to go through state sovereignty. Now, this recognizes that nations have the right to govern themselves and to determine their own destiny. Other nations or organizations have no right to interfere in the internal affairs of another country. State sovereignty is also a major issue in human rights. Funny that. Under the UN Charter, United Nations Charter, all states are fundamentally equal. See Article 21 of the Charter, and it states that the UN is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. Therefore, all states have equal power over their own affairs. Critically, however, in the modern international system, a state sovereignty is not absolute. It is limited under international law by certain duties owed to the international community. That's really important. Without any such limitations, a system of international anarchy would result. Now, regarding human rights, one of the major problems of state sovereignty is that not all governments equally accept the idea that their own people have certain rights. In extreme cases, such countries may commit human rights abuses with impunity, with little or no avenue for their citizens to respond. In such cases, these countries use state sovereignty as a shield to block interference from other countries. States sign numerous agreements to create concrete legal obligations. These agreements are consensual and do not infringe on sovereignty, but put responsibility on the state to uphold their commitments. Now, a couple of questions for you guys to consider. How would you explain the concept of state sovereignty to someone else? And secondly, this one's harder, notice the verb, evaluate the impact of state sovereignty on the promotion and enforcement of human rights. Now that could come up as an HSC short answer response. So take some time, answer those two. Now, as we move on to institutions in human rights, the role of the United Nations is the principal international organization with responsibility for almost every aspect of international affairs. The United Nations has 5 principal organs under the UN Charter. That's really important. All of these have some role to play in the promotion or the protection of human rights. Okay, the UNGA, the General Assembly, United Nations General Assembly consists of representatives from all member states with equal voting power. So no matter how big or how small a country or a state is, they have equal voting power to each other. This is the main forum for international discussions, deliberations, declarations, recommendations, many of which relate to issues of human rights. There are numerous committees, programs, and funds that are attached to the General Assembly, such as the United Nations Development Programme. Another one is the Security Council. Now, this maintains international peace and security. It exercises power through legally binding resolutions and can authorize military actions, sanctions, or peacekeeping operations. The UNSC, remember, United Nations Security Council, has 5 permanent members. They're the big ones: the US, the UK, China, Russia, and France. And there are 10 non-permanent members who each get a 2-year term. At the moment, Australia is one of those, and we are going to, hopefully, according to Julie Bishop, hopefully we'll get another 2-year term. Now, the Human Rights Council, so the UNHRC, has its main purpose to promote and protect human rights by investigating and making recommendations on human rights violations. It was established in 2006 to replace the previous Commission on Human Rights, which was a part of the Economic and Social Council and the Human Rights Commission. The UNHRC has currently brought in a number of specific measures that aim to increase its power to address human rights abuses. That includes a complaints procedure allowing individual people to bring issues to the Council's attention where they have been a victim of human rights abuse in a particular state. Compulsory periodic reviews of the human rights situation in all 192 member states. An advisory committee to provide expertise and advise and recommend issues for Council to consider. And unfortunately, it has already been criticised for not acting in the interests of human rights, but according to political considerations, particularly those of influential states, including China and Russia. Quite notorious, those two. And they've been accused of backing and controlling certain candidates to block criticisms of themselves. Even have a look at the way Russia on the Security Council was blocking moves to have a look at the, I forget the name of the plane, but MH370 I think it was, that was shot down in the Ukraine. You can correct me on those details, which I know you will. Okay, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, we're already a little bit familiar with it, but it hears cases and delivers advisory opinions. It has a role in human rights in defining and interpreting conventions, but cannot adjudicate on disputes raised by individuals. The ICC, or the International Criminal Court, it was set up in response to calls for a permanent court after the genocides in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s. It has jurisdiction over persons alleged to have committed genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Now, some of these international criminal tribunals have been established to deal with serious, widespread breaches of international criminal law, but they are not permanent. Instead, they are limited to time and to location. Now, some examples of those include the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Now, as we move on to independent statutory authorities, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, their mission statement is to, quote, protect and promote human rights for all, end quote. Now, this involves maintaining a high international profile for human rights through speeches, conferences, and publicity. So you can think back all the way to 2009, where the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a strong condemnation of a speech made by Mohammed, oh boy, I really can't pronounce that name very well, Ahmadinejad. You can all have a laugh at that. The president of Iran, at a United Nations-sponsored World Conference against racism, and since then there have been many other examples. Now, there are also 8 human rights treaty bodies, which are committees of independent experts that monitor compliance with the chief international human rights treaties by signatory states. These committees are created in accordance with the provisions of the treaty they monitor. Now, these committees include the Human Rights Committee, Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Committee Against Torture, and the Committee Against Elimination of Racial Discrimination. These are 4 of the 8. There are another 4. I hope you can find them. Now, non-government organisations, or NGOs, they are organisations that work towards a certain cause and operate separately to any government. As concepts of human rights have evolved both internationally and within the Australian legal system, and as the interest in human rights protection has grown among ordinary citizens, the establishment of NGOs concerned with human rights has increased. Non-government organisations were instrumental in establishing the UN Charter and the International Bill of Rights. Many of them operate as observers with the UN and other specialized government agencies in the upholding of human rights around the world. Major international NGOs working in the field of human rights include Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So one of the key features of NGOs is that they are not funded by governments. This means they are independent bodies and not influenced by particular political ideologies, or hopefully they are not. Now, the media can have a huge influence on public opinion. They can embarrass governments into upholding international agreements and human rights principles. However, they can also raise awareness of human rights abuses around the world and rallying public and government action to end such abuses. The growth of dedicated 24-hour news channels and the internet means global news is now broadcast instantly around the world, 24 hours a day. The increasing role of the media is both a positive and it is also a negative influence on the reporting of human rights abuses and on subsequent action. The effectiveness and ineffectiveness of the media in promoting and enforcing human rights will be discussed a little bit later. So some questions. There are 5 here. They're basically just designed to help you for multiple choice and to help for some short answer responses. Attempt those. You should be able to discuss those with your partners and then we can move on. So now that you've done those questions, some areas that you can research for your blogs or for your further research if you're not going to do a blog or some sort of project. I want you to examine the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Serbia and Montenegro. You're going to need to research this online, Google it. Outline the case against Serbia and Montenegro. What happened? On what grounds did the court find Serbia guilty of genocide? If you're still not sure what genocide means, have a look. Have a look of it online. Also have a look at Toonen versus Australia in 1994. I know this is old, but it's really going to help with your understanding. How did Toonen launch proceedings with the United Nations Human Rights Committee? So how did an individual do this? Explain the ruling of the committee. What was the Australian government's response? And the Australian government used the defence that it was unlikely that the criminal law would ever be applied to cases of homosexual activity. Do you think this is sufficient in protecting human rights? Yes, no, explain your answer. And then final part of research, visit 2 of the NGO websites provided previously and answer the following. Identify when the NGO was established, describe the work the NGO does, consider the types of human rights the NGO is attempting to protect, notice the word attempting, and evaluate how the NGO might affect the human rights performance of governments. And that's a plural for governments, not just Australia. Once you've done all that, guys, thanks very much. The next video will include an evaluation of all the different effectiveness of international responses. Hopefully that'll be quite useful to you in your assignments as well. If not, come and ask me some questions. Thanks, guys.